Let's talk about the Edmonton real estate market versus the Toronto real estate market, or perhaps stability versus insanity. Or maybe another way you might look at it is why the Edmonton real estate market is better than the Toronto real estate market. We're gonna look at things like benchmark price differences for two-story homes, one-story homes, apartments, townhouses, property tax levels, land transfer taxes, what your mortgage payments would look like buying these typical properties, and also what's happened to average incomes in both of these areas. And lastly, how these two markets are currently performing in terms of their real estate cycle and the health of those markets by looking at the sales levels, inventory levels, and months of inventory. So I've got a lot I'm going to be covering for you in this video. Let's jump right in. Let's start by comparing benchmark prices in Toronto and Edmonton. This is using the data from the CREA MLS Home Price Index, and I'm going to be looking at it just for the last 10 years. I could have gone back further, but I figured 10 years was enough. And for basically each city, we've got 4 different property types. We've got apartments, townhouses, one-story single-family homes, and two-story single-family homes. Now, if you look at the chart here, you can see everything is cheaper in Edmonton. Starting with Edmonton apartments, you can see going back from 2014, the prices have been pretty much relatively stable. They were on a bit of a downward trend there for a while, but they're pretty much right where they were in 2014, 2015. Whereas if you compare that to the Toronto apartments, that's the red line, you can see that they started off not that much higher than Edmonton prices, but in the last 10 years, they've gotten incredibly more expensive. Same thing for Edmonton townhouses. You can see those are up a little bit in the last 10 years, whereas in Toronto, those are following the same kind of trend as apartments, but they're up a lot as well to over 800,000 now. Whereas the Edmonton two-story homes, that would be the most expensive property type in Edmonton, but it's still looking relatively stable and up a little bit. Whereas if you compare that to Toronto, it was over 600,000 at the beginning, and now it's at like 1.4 million, roughly around there. One-story homes are a little bit cheaper in both Edmonton and Toronto. The Edmonton one-story is the dark dotted line, and then you can see in Toronto, those are also up all the way from between 500,000 and 600,000 initially to over $1 million now. So big differences in benchmark properties. The biggest thing that I would actually point out here is the most expensive property type in Edmonton, the two-story homes, are still significantly cheaper than the cheapest property type in Toronto, which is the apartments. The two-story homes in Edmonton are around that 500K range, whereas apartments are around the 700K range. So it's like night and day difference just looking at benchmark prices. All right, now let's look at this from another angle. Still using the benchmark properties, I want to look at what the actual mortgage payments would be in Edmonton versus Toronto. Just to get this out of the way, this is based on someone putting 20% down on a 25-year amortization at a 4.5% interest rate. This is again using the home price index benchmark prices for all 4 of those property types that we just discussed. Now, even though interest rates are a little bit lower than that now, you can get lower than 4.5% on a fixed term. Depending on when you're watching this video, the interest rates will vary, but you have to pick something and go with that. So let's take a look at apartments first. An apartment in Toronto, that benchmark price we looked at earlier, based on that amortization and interest rate, if you put 20% down, your monthly mortgage payments would be $2,951.24. If you instead bought a benchmark apartment in Edmonton, your monthly mortgage payments would be $873.48. Pretty big difference there. Now, if you look at townhouses for Toronto, you're looking at a monthly mortgage payment of $3,560.93, plus your condo fees and all your other expenses. And in Edmonton, a benchmark townhouse would be $1,190.40. Again, huge difference. Two-story homes is where you see even more insanity, where the benchmark mortgage, if you bought a benchmark property or benchmark two-story property and put 20% down at 4.5% interest, your mortgage payment would be $6,086.12 versus $2,261.73 for a two-story benchmark property in Edmonton. One story is not quite as high at $4,836.67 in Toronto, and $1,754.95 in Edmonton. So pretty stark differences before we looked at just prices, but what does that actually translate into when you're looking at what your monthly mortgage payment might look like? Well, this puts that in perspective for you. Now let's talk about land transfer taxes. This is another area where you're going to see a massive difference between the GTA, Toronto, and Edmonton. In Toronto, you're going to pay both the provincial land transfer tax and the municipal land transfer tax, whereas in Edmonton, you actually don't have a land transfer tax. And just to show you how this breaks down, you can see that they basically charge you a higher percentage on the higher price points. So you can see that 0.5% on the first 55,000, but once you're over 2 million, now you're paying 2.5% on any amount over 2 million going up to 3 million. The step ups vary a little bit from the provincial versus the municipal, but this ends up making a really big difference, especially when you consider the differences in prices that we already looked at. Whereas in Edmonton, it's currently, you basically pay registration fees for the land and then the mortgage when you're getting a mortgage. It's currently $50 plus $2 for every $5,000 of property value for the land registration, and $50 plus $1.50 for every $5,000 of your mortgage amount when registering the mortgage. Those are going to go up substantially, but they're still not going to be anywhere close to what you see in Toronto. In Edmonton, they will be going up to $5 for every $5,000 of property value for the registration, the land registration, and also $5 for every $5,000 of mortgage amount for the mortgage registration. And just to kind of actually give you an example, using the 2-story benchmark price in Toronto, the total land transfer tax for that, based on my calculation, would be $47,994, while the total registration fees for an Edmonton benchmark 2-story home is $977.30. You're talking about an amount that you'd be paying for the land transfer tax in Toronto that is worth essentially about what a 10% down payment would be for a property in Edmonton. Now, if you're a first-time home buyer, there are some rebates that you can apply for in Toronto. You can get a provincial and a municipal rebate that could equal up to around that $8,000, but that's still a massive cash outlay that you're just paying in taxes for the right to buy a property, when you could buy a property in Edmonton with 5% down for like half of that amount. And that's not even taking into account the down payment in Toronto. Now let's talk about property taxes. So again, we're still basing this all off of benchmark prices. I felt that's a fairer way to look at things, because if you're buying a 2-story home in Toronto versus a 2-story home in Edmonton, or an apartment in Toronto or an apartment in Edmonton, what do your total costs look like? And so I've got a little table that I put together here. Again, it's based on the same home price index numbers, and then I just plugged this data into the property tax estimators that are available for both Toronto and Edmonton. I punched in that benchmark value for Toronto and it spit out what the property taxes would be. So a 1-story home, the benchmark price in Toronto was $1,094,600, and that would work out to $7,829 per year for your property taxes, whereas the benchmark price for a 1-story home in Edmonton was $398,500, and you'd have property taxes of $4,054.26. 2-story homes benchmark price in Toronto was $1,376,100. Property taxes are estimated to be $9,843.09, whereas in Edmonton benchmark price is $512,500, and your property taxes would be estimated to be $5,214. Now, one thing I will point out is obviously the total amount is significantly higher in Toronto for a 1-story home there, or any of these property types, versus in Edmonton. Some people will say that Edmonton has a higher percentage that you're paying in property tax, which is true. That's what's called the mill rate. And that's nice if you want to try to say that Toronto has lower property taxes than Edmonton. But the reality is, if you own a 2-story home here or a 2-story home in Toronto, and you're paying basically double in property taxes in total for Toronto, do you really care that it's a lower percentage? Or are you just looking at how much total money that you're throwing out each month or each year in the case of property taxes if you pay annually? Let's continue on. So townhouses, the benchmark price in Toronto in August 2024 was $805,200, and that would equal property taxes of approximately $5,759.51, whereas a benchmark townhouse in Edmonton was $270,000, so your property taxes would be more like $2,746.93. Lastly, apartments, benchmark price was $600 $167,700 in Toronto. So your property taxes would be about $7,775.98, whereas in Edmonton, the benchmark price for an apartment was $197,800. So your property taxes would be more like $2,012.38. Now you might be thinking, well, yeah, prices are a lot higher in Toronto, property taxes are higher, land transfer taxes are higher, but people must be making like way more money in Toronto to be able to afford these differences in prices. So it couldn't be that big of a deal. Well, you'd be wrong. Now we're going to look at average household income. I have data on this from 2006 to 2022, and that's from the CMHC Real Average Household Income 2006 to 2022. And basically, we're just going to compare what's happened in those years in Edmonton and Toronto. You can see in 2006, they started off pretty much the same. Looks like it was around 111,000 average household income in both Toronto and Edmonton. They've both gone up over time. There's definitely been some differences, and they recently crossed. But as of 2022, the average household income in Toronto was $137,400, and in Edmonton, it was $128,800. There's not a huge difference there, and that's the average. There was bigger gaps for a while, and Edmonton obviously caught up in 2020. Or no, I got that mixed up. Toronto was actually quite a bit lower than Edmonton for a long period of time, and according to this data, caught up in 2021, but the prices are like way higher in Toronto. It's unfortunate that I don't have 2023 or partial 2024 data. You know, there's been some market changes since then, but this is what we had to work with. Let's keep going. Now, I want to zoom in on what this actually means for families that are looking to buy a home in Toronto versus Edmonton. We're going to be looking a little bit closer at two-story homes and the relationship between the two-story home benchmark price and incomes. But before we do that, I just want to put it out there that if you're looking at moving from the GTA to Edmonton and you want to buy a reasonably priced property in Edmonton where you can get into it for a much better price, you're not going to pay a massive amount in land transfer taxes, you're going to have cheaper property taxes, and you're going to have a manageable monthly mortgage payment, I'd love to help you with that in the Edmonton area. I am a real estate agent with YEGPro Realty. You can give me a call or shoot me a text at 780-819-5508. Again, that's 780-819-5508. Or you can go to booktrevornow.com and you can set up a free 30-minute consultation call. Again, that's booktrevornow.com. All right, now let's continue on looking closer at the two-story comparison. So zooming in just on the differences in the two-story benchmark prices again, this is the last 10 years. We're just using the home price index again. You can see that at the beginning in 2015, a two-story benchmark property in Toronto was $657,200, whereas in Edmonton, it was $444,400 back in 2014, 2015. In Toronto, it's now $1,376,100, whereas in Edmonton, it's $512,500. There have still been an increase in Edmonton, but that's a lot more stable and level than what we've seen in Toronto. Now, you might have preferred the Toronto scenario if you bought back then, and now you've essentially doubled or more than doubled the value of your home without doing anything. Maybe think about the young families that have not bought their home yet and what it would have been like for you when you bought your property 10 years ago if it was double the price that it was when you actually bought it. So a lot of times people will say that Edmonton market has sucked or something like that because it hasn't seen massive appreciation. But the only people I could really see wanting that are the ones that either already own a bunch of property or they're only really caring about how much money they've made on their personal residence. I don't think they're thinking about what's healthy for the economy and new families and people that are just starting out on whether or not that's something that's actually a good market. This next chart, I actually want to put this into perspective, not just the differences in prices, but now if we actually use that same data and look at how it looks when you combine that with the average income. So this is using the real average household income from CMHC from 2006 to 2022 and the home price index, and we're looking at the price to income ratio for the two-story benchmark homes in Toronto versus Edmonton. So you can see in 2006, basically in Edmonton, the price of a benchmark two-story home was about 3 times the average household income at the time, whereas in Toronto, it was just under 4, so like 3.75 times. They weren't really that far off in terms of where they were at compared to the income, but you can see since then, Edmonton has remained relatively stable and has gone from about 3 to about 4 times household income from 2006 to 2022, whereas in Toronto, it's gone from just under 4 4 to almost 11 times household income. This is not at all based on incomes going up massively along with house prices in Toronto. For me, it really puts it into perspective, like how impossible it would be for most people starting out in Toronto when you need 11 times your household income to buy a 2-story home. It's just not going to happen for most people unless they get help from their parents or commit fraud or something to get that mortgage approved, which is something that has happened by the sounds of it. But Edmonton's been relatively stable. We're not seeing a huge, massive increase in that multiple of price to income ratio. So if you were to look at these two markets and wonder which one might potentially be in a bubble, would you say Edmonton or would you say Toronto? And which one is at more risk of potential big price corrections, Edmonton or Toronto? Part of the reason I wanted to make this video is there's a lot of national news about the housing market, or Toronto or sometimes Vancouver get a lot of attention, whereas Edmonton is usually either not mentioned at all or it's kind of an afterthought. Sometimes they talk about Calgary, but not Edmonton. When you're looking at the Edmonton market and you look at data like this that shows that we're at around 4 times average household income for a 2-story home, and that's only gone up by 1 basically in the last 16 years. It hasn't gone up massively in that multiple. That is a lot more stable. It doesn't make it seem like Edmonton would be massively overpriced and has risks of massive price corrections. Whereas if you look at Toronto, like how the heck are prices supposed to be supported by incomes when it's that much of a multiple? Something to think about there. That's my 2 cents. I'm not an economist, but take what you'd like from that. Here's another quick way to look at that is the percentage of income required for a 20% down payment on the 2-story benchmark homes in Edmonton versus Toronto. You can see in 2006, you needed about 75% of your average household income to get your 20% down payment, whereas in Edmonton, it was a little bit over 50%. They weren't that far off back then, but they really started to split in 2010, and since then, where it's continued to grow in Toronto, whereas it's stayed relatively stable in Edmonton. Now you need about 75% of your annual household income to make up what a 20% down payment would be, whereas it was just over 50 before. So it is still an increase, but that's way more level and way more stable than what we've seen in Toronto. All right, so we've talked a lot about prices for properties, land transfer taxes, property taxes, income levels, and how all of that kind of comes together in Toronto versus Edmonton. But let's now shift to talking about the actual health of the current market conditions in Edmonton and Toronto. So we're going to be looking at a few different charts here and comparing them in Edmonton, Toronto, just to give you a feel for like where each of these markets are at in their current market cycle. So we're going to start with new listings starting in Toronto. So in Toronto, this is basically just looking at a 10-year history for number of new listings. So that's new properties that got put on the market. This is still the August data. The September stuff is not released yet, but it still gives you a pretty good idea of what's going on. So you can see that August 2024 in Toronto, the number of new listings is pretty much right around the 10-year average. 2020 saw a big increase there, but nothing crazy. In terms of new listings in Toronto, at least for August in the last 10 years, it's been fitting with everything else. So it's not super high, it's not super low, so nothing really crazy insightful there. Whereas if we look over at Edmonton, you can see that we're actually kind of at a 10-year high for new listings. It's not super high, it's not way higher, but it is a little bit higher than where we've averaged for the last 10 years. And it's the highest number in the last 10 years. Now, the next thing we'll look at is the sales activity. So this is the actual number of sales. First off, Edmonton, you can see that the sales in Edmonton are actually at a 10-year high for August of 2024. They were pretty stable there for a while. They jumped up a little bit in 2020, 2021, then they went down a little bit in 2022, and then it's grown in both 2023 and 2024. So we're seeing at least an extra 500 sales than usual compared to that 10-year average. Whereas in Toronto, it's pretty much the exact opposite scenario where they're way below their 10-year average. And this 10-year average would have been brought down just from the last 3 years, because you can see in 2022, 2023, and 2024, there was a significant drop in the number of sales, and it's still trending down in the last 3 years. So it's way below the 10-year average, and it's been dropping in the last couple of years. This is something to really pay attention to. In order for a market to be robust in terms of like price growth and stuff, it's hard to do that if you have your number of sales dropping while you also still have a pretty consistent number of listings. And that's what we'll see with the next one is active listings. So this is important to look at compared to the sales activity. In Edmonton, you could see that our sales activity is up, like I said, but now if we look at the active listings, the number of active listings is down. The sales are at like a 10-year high, but the number of actives are actually at a 10-year low in Edmonton. That means we have reduced inventory. So when I'm talking about active listings, that's properties that are on the market right now. They're not sold yet. They're available. People are looking at them. They're sitting on the market. It's active inventory. So when inventory is dropping and sales are going up, that's when you start to see a difference in months of inventory or the absorption rate, which is what we'll get to next. Looking at active listings in Toronto, again, it's the exact opposite scenario. They were at a 10-year high for active listings in Toronto. Significantly higher than the 10-year average and significantly higher in terms of total number than what we've seen in any of the last 10 years. So if you combine that, the active listings in Toronto being up while the sales activity is at its lowest, those two things move into the next category, which is the months of inventory. So this is basically taking those two numbers. You can calculate the months of inventory. Months of inventory is basically how many months it would take to sell all of the active inventory based on the current rate of sales. So if you had 10,000 active listings and there was 1,000 sales that month, you could say you'd have 10 months of inventory, because if you're selling 1,000 a month and you got 10,000 right now, in 10 months, they're all sold. So months of inventory is a way of kind of measuring whether it's a buyer's market, a balanced market, or a seller's market. If you've watched some of my other videos, I usually use the absorption rate instead. It's the same thing that it's showing you, it's just flipped on which way you're doing the math. For example, 2 months of inventory would equal a 50% absorption rate. So that means in 2 months at the current sales rate, you would have sold all your listings. So that means, let's say there was 2,000 active listings and you were selling 1,000 a month. That would be 2 months of inventory, but that would also equal a 50% absorption rate. Now, if you've watched some of my other videos, I usually say it's a buyer's market in Edmonton if the absorption rate is under 30%, whereas I say it's a seller's market if the absorption rate is over 50%. So 50% equals 2 months of inventory and a 25% absorption rate equals 4 months of inventory, just for your reference. So looking at the months of inventory in Edmonton, you can see we're at a 10-year low again on this. So that means you're more in seller's market territory. I would have said that around that 2 months of inventory mark, and we're just above that. So that's been improving since 2022. It's been dropping, whereas in Toronto, again, it's the opposite scenario. And one thing I will point out, I'm saying Edmonton, Toronto, I'm talking about like the GTA, not just the city of Toronto, and I'm talking about the greater Edmonton area, not just Edmonton, just to point that out. So the months of inventory in Toronto are at a 10-year high. They kind of hit their lowest in 2021 when their market was absolutely insane. They're at around 1 month of inventory, and now they're all the way up to like 4.5. If you combine all of that stuff together, you look at the number of new listings, sales, actives, and months of inventory, you can see that Edmonton and Toronto are almost on the exact opposite end of the spectrum in terms of where it looks like they are in their cycle. Everything's slowing down in Toronto, whereas it still kind of looks like things are speeding up in Edmonton. Again, my takeaway from that is definitely looks like there is more risk of price drops in Toronto than there are in Edmonton. Edmonton could actually still continue to see some price growth at this point, just based on the health of the market, what's going on with inventory, sales levels, and the months of inventory. Now, another thing I kind of wanted to look at is population growth in the GTA versus the greater Edmonton area. And so I was able to find some data, and it was basically population growth changes from 2011 to 2016, and then from 2016 to 2021. And so this is from Statistics Canada census data in 2011, 2016, and 2021 for the CMAs. And you can see that from 2011 to 2016, the population grew to 1.32 million in Edmonton, which was almost a 14% increase. And in the 2016 to 2021 range, it grew at almost 8%. So, more like 7% to 1.42 million. In Toronto, on the other hand, from 2011 to 2016, they saw their population grow by about 6% to 5.93 million. And then from 2016 to 2021, it grew to 6.2 million, which was about 4.25%. This shows us another kind of piece of the puzzle. You can see that at least from 2011 to 2021, Edmonton's been growing at a faster percentage. In terms of total population, it's well behind Toronto, but it's growing at a faster percentage, and yet its prices are still more reasonable and affordable and stable. So that tells you there's something else going on. It's not just about they've gotten more population growth in Toronto, and that's why everything's more expensive. Obviously, Edmonton is doing a better job at keeping the market stable by building new homes, having more favorable development processes, reducing the amount of time that it takes to get this stuff done. Now, I don't have great data on like new home starts. That's something maybe I'll look at in another video, but Edmonton's obviously doing a better job when it comes to that in order to keep prices more affordable for people. One example that I will point out on the development side is actually some data that Dr. Mike P. Moffat posted on X back on September 17th, 2024. He basically showed a bunch of municipalities in the GTA and what their development charges were for single family dwelling units in January 2010 versus September 2024. And you've got some examples like in Toronto itself. In January 2010, it was $12,910 in January 2010. And in September 2024, it had increased by 993% to $141,139. So up 128 grand. So a massive increase. That one had probably the highest percentage increase from all the municipalities that he put in the post. But if you look at just the averages, they went on average from $36,381 to $136,229 across, it looks like he's got like 12 or 20 almost municipalities in the GTA there. On average, they went up 274% from 2010 to 2024. Whereas if you just looked at the consumer price index inflation, he put that on there, that went up 41% in that same period. So nothing to do with inflation. They just increased the development charges massively across the GTA. You might think, oh, that's development charges. Well, that's just going to get added on to the cost. It might be the developer paying the development charge, but when they go and sell those properties, they have to still at least break even or make a profit. So all of that is going to the end user. The person buying the property is paying for that increase as well. Unfortunately, I don't have the same numbers available in Edmonton because Mike Moffat hasn't done that, unfortunately. And I have not done that. I appreciate what he did there, but I don't think it's that insane in Edmonton. And that's probably one of the many reasons that our real estate is more affordable. Given a lot of information here, hopefully it wasn't too boring. I just wanted to kind of paint a realistic picture of what things look like in Edmonton versus Toronto when you're buying a house from a price perspective, land transfer tax perspective, mortgage payment, property taxes, how that all compares to income levels, and also where our market is at in Edmonton versus Toronto in terms of the actual market cycle and if it's at risk of popping like a bubble or if it's actually more stable. I hope I've done a good job of displaying all the information. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. Subscribe, like the video, helps get it out to other people. I'm looking forward to making more videos for you guys in the future. Hit that like and subscribe button, and I will see you on the next video. Thanks so much for watching.